In 1960, the average American family bought their first home by age 29 on one income, paying twice their annual salary. Today, a $400,000 price tag and endless hurdles make buying a home before age 40 feel out of reach, even with two incomes. Everyone says just budget better. But if that really worked, why did nearly 40% of veterans return from World War II and get a home almost overnight, while millions now rent for decades with nothing to show? The old advice stopped applying, yet no one admits it. What is the real reason the math broke for America's families? Let's break it down. In 1955, a factory worker earning $4,400 a year could qualify for a $10,000 house. A single paycheck once stretched far enough to buy a home, fill the fridge, keep the car running, and still leave money in the bank. That mortgage, about $55 a month, took up just a quarter of his take-home pay. He did not need a college degree, a spotless credit history, or a second income to make it work. The bills lined up in neat, predictable rows: mortgage, groceries, utilities, the occasional car payment. Even after covering the essentials, there was room for savings or a family vacation. Most mothers stayed home, not because of a moral ideal, but because it was financially possible. Female labor force participation hovered around 35%, and for many families, a second job was a choice, not a necessity. The numbers made sense. A modest house, a stable job, and a single income could deliver the security of ownership by age 30. No one wondered if they would ever get the keys. They just planned when. The idea that home ownership was out of reach would have sounded absurd. The system was designed so that ordinary wages, not windfalls, could turn renters into owners. For millions, the path from paycheck to front porch was short, clear, and wide open. After World War II, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, better known as the GI Bill, rewrote the rules of home ownership in America. Veterans returning from war did not just bring back uniforms and medals. They brought home a government promise: the right to buy a house with almost no money down, at a fixed low interest rate, and with the federal government standing behind the loan. The VA Home Loan Program guaranteed that banks would get paid, even if a borrower defaulted. That safety net meant lenders could take a chance on young couples with little savings and no family wealth. For many, it was their first real shot at building a future. Nearly 40% of all returning veterans used these government-backed loans to buy a home. By 1955, more than 2.4 million veterans had signed the paperwork and moved their families into new houses. The terms were simple: zero down payment, interest rates capped around 4%, and no need for private mortgage insurance. The VA guarantee turned the dream of ownership into an automatic next step for anyone who had served. A factory worker in his 20s could walk into a bank, show his discharge papers, and walk out with a mortgage. The policy did not just help individuals, it fueled a nationwide surge in home buying, raising the home ownership rate from 44% in 1940 to 62% by 1960. For returning veteran couples, this was more than a financial break. It meant stability, a place to raise children, and a way to build wealth for the first time. Government-backed financing made ownership the default path, not a distant goal. The impact rippled through neighborhoods, budgets, and generations, setting a new standard for what was possible in American life. A young couple in the 1950s did not need a perfect credit score, or even know what a credit score was, to buy a house. They walked into a local bank, sat across from a loan officer who probably lived in the same town, and answered questions about their job, their family, and their reputation. Lenders cared about steady work and whether neighbors vouched for your character. A letter from an employer or a handshake from a respected community member carried real weight. If you had held a job for a few years, paid your bills, and seemed trustworthy, the bank wanted your business. Home loans were approved on paper, not by an algorithm. There was no FICO score gatekeeping the process. Instead, a banker might flip through a file of handwritten notes, check a few references, and make a decision that afternoon. This manual approach made it possible for young adults, sometimes just a few years out of high school, to qualify for a mortgage, even if they had little or no credit history. The system favored relationships over rigid formulas. A missed bill or two did not mean automatic rejection. The goal was to help families settle down and build roots, not to maximize profit or minimize risk at all costs. Banks saw lending as a partnership with the community. The success of the neighborhood depended on people being able to buy in and stay put. Today's reality could not be further removed. Modern underwriting runs on credit scores, automated approvals, and risk assessment models that flag even minor financial blips. The local banker has been replaced by faceless software, and a single late payment can shut the door on home ownership for years. In the past, the path to buying a home was paved with trust and human judgment. Now it is guarded by numbers on a screen. Rows of nearly identical houses sprang up on farmland at a pace America had never seen. Builders like Levitt and Sons turned home construction into a science, borrowing techniques from the factory floor. In Levittown, New York, a team could finish a house every 16 minutes at peak speed. The process broke down into 26 steps, each handled by a specialized crew. One group poured slabs, another framed walls, another installed wiring, moving from lot to lot, like an assembly line. Materials arrived in bulk, often sourced directly from manufacturers, or even produced in-house, which kept costs low and schedules tight. There was no room for custom features or wasted motion. Every home followed a standardized blueprint, usually around 800 to 1,000 square feet, 2 or 3 bedrooms, a single bathroom, a compact kitchen, and a living room just big enough for a growing family. The result was a starter home that cost about $8,000 to $10,000, affordable for a young couple on a single income, especially with a VA loan or an FHA loan. By 1951, Levittown alone had 17,000 homes, each with a small yard and a driveway for the family car. This scale of production was possible because land was cheap and regulations were minimal. Builders bought up huge tracts and laid out entire neighborhoods in months, not years. Everything was designed for speed and volume, from pre-cut lumber to pre-assembled staircases. Even the paint was sprayed on in minutes, not brushed by hand. These homes were not luxurious, but they were solid, new, and most importantly, within reach. For millions, this was the first real chance to own property and build equity. The focus was on getting families in the door, not upselling features or chasing profit margins. Mass production met the tidal wave of post-war demand, making homeownership a reality for ordinary Americans. Land on the edge of cities was once so cheap that developers could buy up entire farms for pennies on the dollar. In the late 1940s and the 1950s, a builder might pay as little as $200 per lot for raw land outside towns, like Levittown or Lakewood. There were few hoops to jump through. Zoning boards rarely blocked new subdivisions, and most towns welcomed growth as a sign of progress. A single meeting with a municipal clerk could greenlight hundreds of homes. Permitting fees were minimal, if they existed at all, and environmental reviews were unheard of. The rules were simple. Draw up a grid, lay out the roads, and start pouring foundations. Flexible zoning made it easy to carve up farmland into small lots, sometimes just 5,000 square feet, keeping prices low and supply high. Cities and towns competed to attract new residents, offering tax breaks or even helping with infrastructure. Builders did not have to set aside land for parks or pay for new schools up front. Impact fees, which now add tens of thousands to the cost of each house, simply were not part of the equation. Most neighborhoods allowed basic single-family homes with no requirements for fancy facades or extra parking spaces. This permissive environment meant developers could focus on building as many homes as families needed, not just the ones that maximized profit. The low cost of land flowed directly into lower home prices. For buyers, that meant a starter house was truly affordable. No special connections, no waiting lists, just a straightforward path from renting to owning. Municipal zoning boards acted more like partners than gatekeepers, clearing the way for a generation of young families to put down roots. The abundance of cheap, buildable land was the silent engine behind the post-war homeownership boom, making it possible for ordinary people to buy in while they were still young. Monthly mortgage payments in the 1950s came with a kind of certainty that is almost impossible to imagine today. For most buyers, the interest rate on a 30-year fixed loan hovered between 4 and 5%. That number did more than make payments affordable. It made them predictable. Federal Reserve records show that for nearly 2 decades after World War II, rates barely budged. A young couple could sign a mortgage in 1955 and know, down to the penny, what they would owe every month until their kids finished college. There were no sudden spikes, no wild swings from one year to the next, and no guessing games about whether the bank would jack up the cost halfway through. This stability mattered. A $10,000 home at 4% interest meant a payment of about $48 a month, less than a week's wages for a factory worker at the time. The rate was not just low, it was locked in. Families could budget, save, and plan for the future without worrying that a change in the global economy would send their housing costs through the roof. Government backing of VA and FHA loans helped keep these rates steady, and banks competed for borrowers by offering fair terms instead of hidden fees. Contrast that with today's landscape. In 2025, a rate of 7% on a median-priced home means a payment that is hundreds of dollars higher each month, even before insurance and taxes. For young buyers now, the uncertainty is as punishing as the price tag. In the mid-century era, low and stable rates turned the dream of homeownership into a reality for millions of young families. Predictability was not just a perk, it was the foundation that made planning, saving, and buying a home possible. A new player changed the rules of the housing market: the institutional investor. After the 2008 financial crash, private equity firms and corporate landlords started buying up single-family homes by the thousands. They paid in cash, closing deals in days, while families needed weeks for mortgage approval. In cities like Atlanta, Phoenix, and Charlotte, investor purchases jumped to more than 20% of all home sales, sometimes even higher. For young families, this meant bidding wars against companies with deep pockets and no contingencies. A couple scraping together a down payment could not compete with a fund offering full price, sight unseen. By 2022, investors controlled an estimated 3 to 5% of all single-family homes nationwide, but in hot markets, their share soared to a quarter of sales. The result was a squeeze: fewer homes for sale, higher prices, and rents that climbed as corporate owners turned houses into permanent rentals. The path to ownership narrowed, not because people stopped trying, but because they were outbid before they could even get in the door. A college degree used to open doors. Now it often comes with a ball and chain. This is student debt. In the 1960s, a year at a public university cost a few $100s, sometimes less than a month's rent. Most students graduated owing nothing, ready to start saving for a down payment as soon as they landed a job. Today, the average graduate leaves school with more than $30,000 in student loans, according to the Department of Education. For many, that number is even higher. Monthly payments eat into paychecks before rent, groceries, or car insurance are even covered. Instead of building up savings, young adults spend years digging out of debt. The dream of buying a home gets pushed further down the road, not because of daily lattes, but because every dollar earned is already spoken for. The reality is simple: student debt delays everything. For millions, the journey to homeownership now starts with a stack of loan bills, not a set of house keys. For millions of Americans today, renting isn't a brief stop on the way to a mortgage. It is the destination. The Census Bureau reports nearly a third of adults under 40 have rented for more than a decade, with no end in sight. Lease renewals replace closing dates. Security deposits pile up, but down payments remain out of reach. Rents rise faster than paychecks, eating up half or more of monthly income in many cities. The typical renter now moves every few years, chasing affordable units or escaping sudden hikes from new landlords. Stability is a luxury, not a guarantee. In the 1960s, most families rented for a year or two before buying. Now, long-term tenants watch as home prices climb further out of reach. The idea of owning by 35 has faded for a generation that spends their 20s and 30s paying someone else's mortgage. For these renters, the dream of a starter home has become a story from another era, one that feels less possible with every passing year. For millions, the American home is now a distant milestone, not a given. As corporate buyers and policy inertia drive prices ever higher, home ownership slips further out of reach for each new generation. The rules changed, but expectations didn't. If this gap keeps growing, the foundation of middle-class life risks collapse. What would it take to rebuild a system that works for everyone? Share your thoughts below.